Good afternoon, NACTO. Can everybody hear me? Great. Welcome to Los Angeles. This is my hometown and the hometown of the National League West Division champion LA Dodgers. Nice. And I thought everyone was from out of town. Always good to have the Bay Area in the house also. My name is Naomi Iwasaki, as Gary Lee said, and I'm with Investing in Place. We're a policy advocacy organization that seeks to align transportation investments with data-driven need across LA County. I am honored to be here today to facilitate this conversation between Senator Wiener and Dr. Strathmann. This is their third conversation about transportation and land use, so you two are saying all the smart things to keep getting invited back to talk about all of this. Today we're going to talk about transportation and land use, and everyone here knows that those two are wedded together. But transportation typically happens in public agencies with you fine folk, with your planners' gazes and engineers' precision. But land use is usually determined in a political process, and housing specifically is driven by the market. So we know that transportation and housing are married, but how can we get them to be that better couple that we know that they can be? Senator Wiener, I'd love to start with you. You've been a leader in addressing the housing shortage crisis in the state, and your legislative work supports aligning dense development and transit. So if you could start us off with your thoughts on the impacts that transportation and housing have on the quality of life for your constituents and also all of California.
Sure. So thank you very much for having us today, and thank you for all the work that you do. I know there are a lot of amazing leaders here from around the country, and sometimes it's an uphill battle trying to get good transportation and land use policy, but thank you for the work that you do. I think in terms of specifically let me start by specifically how my constituents are impacted. My constituents are impacted, even though San Francisco is a lot denser than most places, although for the record, 70% of San Francisco is zoned either for single-family homes or two-unit buildings. That's approximately 70%. So even in a place like San Francisco, we see some unsustainable land use patterns. But we are a lot denser than just about anywhere else in the state, except for a few parts of LA. And how my constituents are impacted is that many of them are being displaced out of our city because of our refusal in California and in San Francisco and in the Bay Area to have enough housing for people, our refusal to invest enough in affordable housing, and so people have to leave, or they leave and then they want to come back and they can't come back, or they are living in highly overcrowded situations, multiple families in a one-bedroom apartment, or they are just becoming homeless. So that's how it's impacting my constituents. But looking at sort of the big picture, we made a conscious decision actually not so much conscious, but somewhat conscious in California a few decades ago, that we were going to ban apartment buildings, ban multi-unit housing in a significant swath of our state, in the Bay Area, in LA, all over. No more apartment buildings, only single-family homes, maybe 2 units if we're feeling charitable. And that decision was made as the state was progressively downzoned in the 1960s and 70s. We did it in the 70s in San Francisco. LA did it in the 80s. And we did it because people wanted to preserve everything as is, and said, this is my lifestyle, and so we're going to just shut down that housing pipeline and not allow multi-unit. And when you do that, you basically say there's going to be less housing in our community. We are effectively going to ban poor people from living here, because if you ban multi-unit, you're banning any kind of lower income housing, and you are making housing dramatically more expensive. And what it also did was it led to the inevitable conclusion that the housing that we do build is going to be further and further and further and further out. And so that made housing incredibly expensive in our job centers, in our areas that actually have public transportation. It meant that fewer people can use public transportation because they can't live anywhere close to it. And it meant that we then had to, as we sprawled further out, we had to completely pivot and design a new transportation system for sprawl, which means more freeways. It makes it very hard to actually have transit serving a good part of the state. And so what do we have today? We're reducing carbon emissions in California, except it's going up around transportation. We continue to push people into 1.5 hour, 2-hour commutes each way, so we undermine our climate goals. People are away from their families. People are exhausted by the time they get to work, and it's unhealthy. People get back problems, diabetes, all the other problems, because we decided we didn't want to have enough housing where we should have the housing. We're going to just sprawl out and then design this unsustainable transportation system. And that is really hard to reverse. We're trying to reverse it. SB 827 was one stab at doing that, and we're working with, I think, a broader coalition to try to bring back a different version of it. But you think about the decades it took to get to that unsustainable pattern, and now we're trying to reverse it. And it's hard, but I think we can get there.
Thank you, Senator. And I'm glad you brought up what got us here today. I'd like to pivot to Dr. Strathmann, whose work at SAGE positions vulnerable residents, which are the end users of these transportation and land use policies, at the center of the conversation. And I think we all can agree that transportation and land use policies haven't always been equitably implemented. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about that frame and how we got here today with that.
Well, thank you very much. So SAGE, the organization that I work at, is in South Los Angeles on the South Figueroa corridor. And this is a part of Los Angeles that historically has been really underinvested in. A lot of Los Angeles was redlined and has been extremely segregated throughout its history. And so the fact that these areas were disinvested in was not accidental. That was part of policy. And now that they are, now that we're a little short, as Senator Wiener mentioned, a lot short on housing, and we're somewhat underdeveloped, these are areas where we've seen a lot of interest in development. So the residents that we work with at SAGE are predominantly extremely low income, household incomes ranging from $10,000 to $20,000 a year, mostly immigrants. Many of them are monolingual Spanish speaking. They are high frequency transit users. A lot of them do not own automobiles at all, and so they are on transit all the time. And they are living in some of the most overcrowded housing in the United States. It might not be dense, but because it is not dense, it is overcrowded. And it's all right along these transit lines. And so what we unfortunately have seen is that as you're seeing increased development in the downtown area and also now coming into South Los Angeles, that despite the fact that there are a lot of units that are being built very near our members, they are not the kinds of units that our members are ever going to be able to live in. And in fact, while we really support the development of housing for the folks that live in these areas, because it is acutely and desperately needed, they can't afford to live in those units, and then often after those often very luxurious units are built, it drives up the price of the units that they're actually living in themselves. And we've had situations, which I think are probably just the tip of the iceberg, where tenants are coming into our weekly tenant clinics saying, I'm being pushed out by my building manager, and the building manager is telling them things like, we need to flush all the Mexicans out of this building, we're going to flip it, and make more money. And so even though, the idea I think is to build out along transit corridors and make sure that more people can live there, SAGE's perspective is, yes, we want to do that, and we want to make sure that there is housing there and tenant protections there so that the high frequency transit riders that are living there can stay there. Transit's desperately important to them to get to their jobs. As a lot of you know, it's the single biggest indicator of whether or not somebody is going to be able to escape from poverty is whether or not they're living along a transit corridor. So that's very valuable to us.
Thank you. So there seems to be this shared vision of a utopia with affordable housing and dense land uses adjacent to high quality transit, shared here on stage and possibly with many folks in the audience. So I think what's exciting about this conversation, it's not just NIMBY versus YIMBY, right? Like the two of you support the same outcomes, but getting there, maybe we have different ideas of the best way to do that. There's a lot of nuance to consider. who is living in this utopia, who's riding transit, and how do we implement that? So, Senator, I'd love to hear your take on what the right mechanisms are to serve a diverse mix of riders along a transit corridor, and what the state's role could play in that.
Sure. Well, so first of all, we have to make sure, as we make massive transit investments, and we need absolutely massive transformational investments in public transportation. I want to tip my hat to Los Angeles, which, I mean, the voters here have just been unbelievably generous in supporting transit. And even though, you know, we in the Bay Area, we've had more transit infrastructure than LA, you know, we need to, you know, get our act together in terms of our own investments, which we are doing, but, you know, we're competitive. We don't want LA, we want LA to catch up, and then we stay just a little bit ahead. But seriously, we need to be mutually supportive, because it's so important in all of these areas to have high quality transit. And we need to make sure that as we're making these investments, we're making them in a smart and sustainable way. We have fights in the Bay Area. There's a constant desire to build new BART lines into areas that have very low density zoning. So instead of, whereas the core of our BART system is really struggling, where we actually have high ridership, a lot of density, a lot of low-income working class people relying on the system, there's a constant tension about, you know, we don't want to add any more housing or no density, but we want a BART line. And it ends up taking a lot of resources from the core system. So we need to make sure that we're taking care of the systems we have, and that as we expand, and I support expanding our transit systems, we're doing it in a way that aligns with good, sustainable land use patterns. And so we want to make sure that the two always travel together, transit expansions and high density housing. So you have the ridership, and so that you are actually allowing people to drive less. It also means that you have to have, and I agree with Cynthia, you have to have strong anti-displacement protections. We want, as we add density, we want it to be additive, not replacing people who are already living in a community. And that means not tearing down their homes. That's like the baseline. Don't tear down the places where people are actually living. And then on top of it, make sure that, you know, as you go through, especially transition periods, that people are able to stay in the homes that they have, even if they're not being torn down, that they're not being evicted. And I think there is a way to do that. And when you look at the housing fights that we have in this state, I think there is a way to marry some of these things. That we're going to have higher density housing in job centers, near transit, so that as we fill in our 3.5 million home deficit in California, we don't do sprawl. We want to put it near jobs and transit. To do that, at the same time, keeping people stable in the housing that they have, and investing in housing for lower income people, because you know, my view is that the market is never going to produce housing in much of California that is affordable to low-income people. Tragically, we are past that era when that used to happen. It's not happening in many places anymore. We're also not going to be able to subsidize our way out of our middle-class housing problem. We need more supply for the middle class. So we have to do both, and then protect people in the housing they have, and then make sure that we're actually aligning where the transit is going with those scarce dollars to match where the people are, where the density is.
Did you want to respond to any of that specifically?
I would just agree wholeheartedly. I think we really do need to make sure that we're protecting the tenants who live, because in Los Angeles, especially in the places where we're working, the majority of people are tenants. Even in single family housing, we need to make sure that they're very much protected, and then we also need to make sure, and Los Angeles, of course, is in a different position where we're building out our transit now. And while I think SAGE and many of our allies are very supportive of the idea of transit, we do want to make sure that as that transportation gets built, it basically changes the value of the land alongside it, and it has the potential to very much change the neighborhoods as it is being built. And we want to make sure that it doesn't change them to the extent that the people who are living there now don't get to live there in the future. And then there's also, of course, a question around small businesses too. So this becomes very much a question of like, what kind of community are you going to build that transit for? We can't take it for granted that that community isn't going to change radically once the transit is built. And that requires some holistic thinking and some forward thinking. We can't assume that it's going to happen naturally. I think you have to make sure that there are policy measures in place. And from a transportation perspective, I think the interest is, you know, people who like the idea of transportation want everybody that they can get on transportation. And if you sort of shoo a lot of people out who are the people who are most likely to use it, you will end up with a transportation system that's actually serving less people. And then you'll have all of those folks, as Senator Wiener mentioned is happening in the Bay Area, being pushed far out of the city. And you can actually see transit ridership drop, and you can see greenhouse gas emissions go up, because now all of the folks, you know, that we work with who are driving cars, but not honestly that great of cars now that they're living out, you know, in Palmdale or wherever, are driving into the city and really increasing the pollution footprint.
Thank you. I think part of how transportation and housing specifically are married is that we use land use to solve transportation problems. And I just want to kind of call out that as we say transit over and over again on stage, what I'm hearing us talk about is fixed rail. But transit is much more than rail, as many of the city transportation officials in the room know very closely. And so is there a way that transportation can help solve some of our land use issues? Bus rapid transit and other forms of public transportation are easier to build, they're faster, they're less expensive. Senator, I guess I'd be interested in your ideas around what sort of transportation options can support the existing land use we have as we're trying to coordinate improving it all together.
Yeah, so I'm a bus person, so I love buses, and
buses.
And we are. I live by a subway line. I take it a lot, but buses, you know, you actually get to see your community, and if it breaks down, you can get off the bus, but I think in a lot of ways, buses and public transit in general, but especially buses, it's like it can be the great equalizer. Everyone's on that bus together, and so I think it's really important. And buses are, as much as I'm a strong supporter of fixed rail and subways, and that incredibly important. We can't neglect the bus system, because we know that a significant swath of our transit system, it's buses, and I don't see that changing, and we can't neglect it. When people are getting really shoddy bus service, it's no wonder that the ridership is going to be lower, that you're not going to have an economic mix, and the people who ride the bus are going to be, you know, the people who have no choice but to ride the bus. We want people to also choose to ride the bus, and it is, you know, it is a lot less expensive, but we do have to make sure that we're making the roads usable by buses. If buses are just caught in congestion, then it's going to be self-defeating, and so bus-only lanes, bus rapid transit are quite important, and as our Director of Transportation, Ed Riskin, knows, the fights we have in San Francisco about the red lanes for buses are pretty epic. People don't want to give up road space, but we have to do that. And but even with that said, even with buses, when you're making bus investments, I do think density needs to go with that. And one of the pushbacks that we got around SB 827 last year was you should limit it only to fixed rail, because, you know, buses just change all the time. Bus routes are constantly changing. And it was almost a very dismissive attitude towards buses, like it's not real transit. It's like this temporary thing that just gets, you know, flipped around all the time, which is not true. And I think we need to do a better job conveying that buses are actually the heart of public transportation.
Thank you. Did you want to respond? Give it up for buses. That's definitely true in Los Angeles, where we are seeing unprecedented investment in building out our fixed rail. But we're a bus town. 70% of our transit riders take the bus, and they are vulnerable. I think the average income of a bus rider in Los Angeles County is about $15,000, which are exactly the residents that SAGE and other organizations advocate on behalf of. Dr. Strathmann, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the role of market rate and mixed income housing, and if SAGE and your organization sees a role for that in this whole process. We of course want to build and preserve and protect affordable housing, but is there a role for the market, and what could that look like?
Well, I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, is that you know, market rate housing can play a somewhat negative role in the sense that it can drive gentrification pressures by really changing the value of all of the housing in a neighborhood while not really supplying housing that the people in the neighborhood actually need. You know, at the same time, we do need housing that's subsidized for lower income people, and I think it's unlikely, particularly given our current, you know, administration, that we're going to see a massive investment into public and social housing, however much that might be needed. So, you know, in that situation, market housing actually can become a way to build affordable housing near the transit lines that we need by using by letting people build market rate housing there as a way to incentivize more affordable housing that other residents want. And you know, and there's also, I think, a real difference in different neighborhoods and in different cities about what the relative need is and what the role of market rate is going to be in those different places. I think that if you asked advocates, are you in favor of building increased density at market housing in some of the more exclusionary neighborhoods, we would not be nearly as averse to it as we would in building a lot of luxurious market rate housing in areas that are kind of on the tipping point of gentrification, because the social effect of that housing is going to be that market rate housing is going to be really different.
Did you want to add anything to that, Senator? So I feel like we'd be remiss to discuss land use and transportation at a NACTO plenary without talking about parking. So, Senator, I'd love to hear your thoughts about parking incentives or disincentives that might work to achieve this vision of high-density land use and affordable housing near all sorts of transit.
Sure. When I talked about how we, through low-density zoning, created sprawl, which then, you know, changed the face of California. We didn't just do low-density zoning. We also went through this period, and I guess it was like the 40s to the 60s, where we basically redesigned everything around the car, and in terms of roads and parking lots and parking structures and requiring parking in housing development, and it's been really destructive. It takes up enormous amounts of space. When you think about the amount of space that we devote to cars, it's extraordinary. You know, I'm not a fan of mandating minimum parking requirements in new housing because all it does is, all it does is it makes the housing more expensive, because, you know, in San Francisco, last I checked, it was like added, it's probably more now, $50,000 to $75,000 per unit. I bet you it's higher now. And it means you're building less housing. When you think about it, you look at a building and the amount of space being devoted to parking, that could be additional units. And if you have an inclusionary ordinance, it means more affordable units as well. It's really significant. And a lot of developers will tell you that I don't want to build all this parking. They're forcing me to do it. And I think that each development should be judged on its own merits. Yes, if it's a building that is not near transit, it's not realistic to expect people to use transit, you're probably going to have a different calculus than if you're building near transit. In San Francisco, we've been gradually eliminated minimum parking requirements, and we now have maximum parking, and they tend to be quite low. So and the big but is, you have to have the transit investment along with it. You can't just say no parking, but we're not going to provide the great transit. You have to do that, and sometimes it's clunky. You'll have people who will say, well, we can't do anything about changing parking requirements until we have perfect utopian transit, and that's not reality. The two have to catch up with each other. But I will also add that on top of transit, we have to be open to other forms of transportation so that people can get around without owning their own car. Because transit is never going to work for everyone all the time. So we have to make it easy for people to bike, whether it's with their own bike or whether it's with bike sharing. We have to make it easy for people to, if we're not going to have enough taxis, then having other models like ride sharing, using ZEVs. And we have to embrace, I think, newer technologies like e-scooters, which I know everyone's having a lot of fun debating e-scooters in all of our cities. But regardless of the growing pains, and with ride sharing, there's a lot of growing pains in terms of what's the right level of regulation. All these things have to be well regulated. But it's about giving people the ability to live and get around without owning a car. And if we're willing to do that instead of having sometimes knee-jerk responses against new modes of transportation, I think that we can make it easier for people to transition into a world with less parking.
Thank you.
I mean, I completely agree that we are trying to get to a world without cars. I mean, cars are a huge expense, I think, for people that many people can't afford. So living in a world that's designed for cars when you can't afford a car is very, very difficult and time consuming. I guess a couple of thoughts I would throw out there into that discussion are, one nice thing from an advocate's perspective is if you have required parking, it gives you something to trade away. Developers don't want to do it, so if you require that they do it, then you can have something that you can say that you're going to let them not do in return for something else, which you might want. So that's actually one way in which having mandatory parking has been, I think, somewhat helpful. And in fact, in the TOC program, that Los Angeles has, you see reduced parking requirements in exchange for density. And then another thing about parking, I don't really have an answer to this, but I think it's an interesting problem, is that for some people they really need, for often more blue-collar people, they will sometimes need a vehicle to do the kinds of work that they do. And so I think if we're going to keep those folks, the gardeners and the construction workers living in our cities amongst the rest of us, we're going to have to figure out what at some point to do with people's personal work vehicles. No solutions, just throwing out the problem.
If I could just add, and that's a really important point. I think sometimes I'll have constituents come at me saying, you're trying to confiscate my car, I need my car to do X, Y, or Z, and you want to ban cars and make it so no one's allowed to drive. And there are people who would like to see that, but in terms of what's actually happening, it's when it comes to parking, it's not about just making all cars evaporate tomorrow. That's not reality. But if you can give people the option of not driving because you're actually building housing near where they work, near transit, you have a great transit system, you have ride sharing or taxis available for when they need to get around in a car but don't want to own their own car, you let them bike, you may have neighborhoods that are walkable where you can walk down the street without getting killed. All of these things, you have great transportation options for people. Then even if X percentage of people decide I'm giving up my car, you have a lot less traffic and a lot more parking available for that segment of the population that needs a car to get around. So it's in everyone's interest to have great land use patterns and great transportation options so that we can, I think, make life better for everyone, including the people that need to drive.
Thank you. Yeah, I think choice is a really important component of all this and making sure that we're doing this comprehensive land use and transportation planning together. I left my phone at my table. Are we okay on time? 5 minutes? Okay. That was fast. So maybe then to sort of start to wrap up the conversation, I think, I think the senator touched on this a little bit, but part of getting this right is balancing immediate needs like housing security and vehicle congestion with the long-term goals of where we want to go, and also the long-term impacts like climate change, or building out a transportation infrastructure system that serves everybody. So how can the practitioners in the room and the elected officials that we have and the advocates that we have try to balance those immediate needs with our long-term goals? And perhaps I'll go to you first, Dr. Strathmann. Thanks.
Well, I think, first of all, you have to keep the long-term goals in mind. I think a lot of times we tend to have these immediate reactions. There's a housing shortage now, like let's build lots and lots of housing, and then, 10 or 15 years from now, we might be facing a problem that we, caused by, unintentionally by doing that without really considering what the long-range plan patterns are. I think I'd be remiss in getting through this whole panel without mentioning that there is like a chronic problem in this bigger picture with NIMBYs, and I think especially as we live in a world that's more wealth stratified, people who have a lot of money and who have traditionally had a lot of clout, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with dealing with these kinds of folks who categorically don't want to build anything anywhere and kind of like live in this past that's a little bit wider, a little bit richer, and really kind of create these exclusionary communities within cities that don't include people. I think that's going to be a big and important part of really trying to conceptualize the long-term and contrast addiction with the immediate demands, because those folks can make demands, and they will be very loud. And I think to really sort of think about, and I know this is kind of California-centric, but, what is the California of the far future, of the 30 or 40-year out future going to be? It's not going to be just those folks complaining vehemently and loudly every chance they get. And I think the intentionality beside really thinking about like who are you talking to, it's really important to keep that long-term vision alive. Like what do we have to do to get to a vision of a more inclusive and fairer and sustainable future where we can all live in cities and all use public transportation, and some of us aren't being excluded and shut out of that? How do we make sure that we get to this kind of transit-rich green city and don't get stuck in something where you have townships outside of the city that are not even included in part of the civic life? So, I guess that's what I would say is, really try to think about who you're listening to and what you can do in response to them when you're making your short-term decisions so that you can keep your long-term vision, firmly in view.
I would say two things. The first is, and I don't know if this has just always been the way human beings have been. I actually think it's more of a modern challenge that we have, where I don't think we think as a society, we don't think as long-term as we used to. It's about the here and now, which of course the here and now matters with our daily struggles, and public policy has to take that into account, making sure people can survive and be stable and successful today. But I think around housing and transportation in particular, more and more I get a reaction from people sort of throwing up their hands, saying to me, well, you say that if we build a bunch more housing, that it's going to make things more affordable. Well, yeah, you're right, but it might take 20 years. And my response is, what's that old saying? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. That yes, we should have been doing this a long time ago, but we didn't. And so let's start, if it's going to take 20 years, let's start today, so that even if we're not the over-the-top beneficiaries of it, maybe our kids and our grandkids will have fewer struggles than we're having today. The same with transit investment. When people say, oh my God, it's going to take so long to build out that massive rail, bus rapid transit, et cetera, system that we need for the entire LA metro area or for the entire Bay Area. It's going to take so long and painful and disruptive, and it's going to cost us a lot of money, and you throw up your hands and say, well, we didn't say that when we built the BART system, right? There's a lot of things that, and BART was like 30 years, I think, from conception, the initial idea, to actually rolling it out. But we did it. We did it. And so I think we have to really try to reframe the discussion as, yes, even though we all want to take care of people's needs today, make sure people aren't being evicted today, make sure that people can get on a bus or a train and go where they're going today, we have to keep in mind that this is a long-term project. And I'll tell you, as an elected official, it's one of the hardest things to, hitch your caboose to, we're going to solve the housing crisis, right? If you're an elected official, you want to do things that within a year or two, you're going to see a tangible result. We're going to get this park renovated. We're going to, have a new, better paid parental leave. Incredibly important. You can deliver that like in a year. Pass a law and mandate it, and then it happens. Housing happens, the benefits from the work that we're doing will probably manifest, I hope, but probably after I'm termed out of office. And so we have to have that long-term thinking. But the other piece of that is long-term thinking doesn't mean long-term ad infinitum planning processes. So in San Francisco, I call it the 10-year rule. It takes us 10 years to environmentally clear a bus rapid transit line. It takes us 10 years to environmentally clear a rezoning, an area plan rezoning, like several that we've done in San Francisco. Everything is 10 years. Why on earth does it take 10 years? Part of it is because we, in California, we like to just continually argue and debate with each other and never end the process, but we have to do these things faster. You can have a deliberative, thoughtful, inclusive planning process that doesn't take a huge number of years, because the problem is now, and if we're going to plan for the future and get it done over time, we have to actually make these decisions and move forward.
Thank you. I think people in the just going to agree with the 10-year rule in Los Angeles. Those in the room that worked on the My Figueroa project have been working on it for 10 years, and it finally was born this year.
By the way, to be clear, I'm not criticizing the planners. This is, we have to look at it's really about our small d democracy where we really, we have trouble ending the process and saying, you know what, you've been heard, but not everyone gets what they want. So, to be clear.
Thank you. So I think we're done on time. We thank you very much, Senator and Dr. Strathmann, for your thoughtful and very intelligent experiences and words. I can see why you've been chosen to talk about this repeatedly, so I hope I'm there for the 4th installment of your Transportation Land Use Series conversation. Thank you, everyone. I don't know if we're doing Q&A? Oh. Now we're doing breakout sessions, and I would encourage you to look at your programs for that because I can't tell you anything else. Thank you very much.